There are moments, and they come most often in the kind of stillness that is settling around you right now. When the world outside has gone quiet, and the light has left the room, and the body has begun, slowly and without being asked, to release the weight of everything it carried through the day. When something happens to your sense of time that is difficult to describe and impossible to dismiss. Not a thought, and not quite a feeling. Something more like a texture, a quality that arrives in the present moment from a direction the senses do not normally face, bringing with it a certainty so specific and so sourceless that the mind stops moving for a moment and simply holds it. The way you might hold an object you have found in the dark that you recognize completely but cannot name. You have been here before. Not in the autobiographical sense, not the sense of a memory you can retrieve and examine and place in the correct position in the sequence of your life. In a deeper and stranger sense than that. The moment you are in right now feels, for just an instant, like a moment you have already lived, already known from the inside, already carried in some part of you that does not file memories in the ordinary way. You are listening to Midnight Sleep Chronicles, and tonight our archives open around one of the most intimate experiences available to a human consciousness. One that has occurred to almost every person who has ever lived, in every language, in every century, in every culture that has ever tried to describe what it is like to be a mind moving through time. And that science is only now, in this particular decade, learning to approach with something like the right instruments for the right question. Tonight we ask, what if the present moment is not as new as it appears? And what if the part of you that knows this is older than memory? Let the weight of you settle now into whatever is receiving you. Let the breath find its own rhythm. We begin. It happens when you are least prepared for it. And that is part of what makes it so disorienting, the fact that it arrives not as the result of any effort or any intention, but simply as an event. The way weather arrives. The way the quality of light in a room changes without your having done anything to change it. The way a particular song from a particular period of your life can reach you through a speaker in an ordinary shop on an ordinary afternoon and do something to the quality of the present moment that no amount of deliberate recollection could have produced. Perhaps you are standing at a kitchen counter on an unremarkable Tuesday, doing something you have done 1,000 times, filling a glass with water, or looking out a window at a street you know well, or turning to speak to someone whose voice you have heard every day for years. And something in the arrangement of these ordinary things, some particular combination of the angle of the light and the weight of the air and the specific quality of the silence between sounds, produces in you a sensation that is completely unlike anything that ordinary moments produce. Or perhaps it is a larger stage. A city you are visiting for the first time, the streets still unfamiliar under your feet, the architecture carrying the marks of a history you have only encountered in books. You are moving through it all, with the particular alertness of someone genuinely encountering the new, drinking in the details because they are still details. Because the eye has not yet had enough repetition to begin ignoring them. The angle of a roofline, the particular way cobblestones hold rainwater in their seams, the smell of cooking from an open window 3 floors above the street. The sound of a conversation in a language you do not speak passing through you like music, whose meaning you cannot locate, but whose mood you feel entirely. You are here, in all of this, open to all of it, fully present in the novelty of it. And then, without transition, without preparation, without the slightest indication in the preceding moment that anything unusual is about to occur, something shifts. Not in the street, not in the light or the smell or the sound. Nothing in the external world has changed. The change is entirely interior, and it arrives not gradually, but all at once, the way a word arrives in the mind when you have been searching for it. Suddenly there, fully formed, carrying its complete meaning, coming not from any direction you can identify, but simply being present where it was not present a moment before. And what arrives is this: you have been here before. Not probably, not approximately, not in any way that involves doubt or qualification or the careful hedging that the mind normally applies to uncertain claims. With a certainty that feels more like recognition than belief, more like the certainty with which you recognize a face you love than the certainty with which you hold a philosophical position. You know that this exact configuration of the world, this particular angle at which the afternoon light falls between these particular buildings, this precise sequence of sounds arriving in this exact order, this specific arrangement of shadow and warmth and unfamiliar smell, and the feeling of your own feet on the ground. You have been inside this before. It has already happened to you. You are somehow, impossibly, living it a second time. And then, before you can turn to look at it directly, before you can ask it where it came from or reach for the memory it seems to be drawing from, it is gone. Gone in the time it takes to complete one breath, leaving behind it only the street, which is just a street, and the afternoon, which is just an afternoon, and the slight and specific residue of something that refuses to be explained. The sense of having briefly been somewhere that could not have been visited, of a door that was open for a few seconds, having closed again, of a depth in the present moment that the present moment does not usually possess and that you cannot now re-access, no matter how carefully you look in the direction it came from. This is the experience that the French language named already seen. 2 syllables that have been carrying across the century and a half since they were first used to name this phenomenon. Something that language in any tongue finds difficult to fully hold. The experience of the present moment becoming, for one impossible instant, indistinguishable from a memory that cannot be located. Hold that for a moment. Let it settle. It occurs to roughly 2/3 of all people at some point in their lives, which means, in the particular quiet of this room, in the darkness that has gathered around you as the world has let itself go still for the night, that the probability is very high that you, encountering a description of something foreign, but recognizing something intimate, something that has happened in your own body, that you know from the inside in the only way this kind of knowing is available. Not through information, but through the specific, unrepeatable texture of having been there, of having stood in that strange, suspended moment, of having felt the present briefly become something thicker and more layered than it usually is. The experience typically lasts only a few seconds. It is gone before the mind can fully turn its attention toward it, gone before the conscious effort to understand it can reach whatever it was that produced it. And in that brevity, there is something significant, something that the neuroscientists who have spent decades studying this phenomenon have found instructive. Because the shortness of it is not accidental but structural, a consequence of the particular mechanism that produces it, which is one of the most quietly remarkable stories in the science of the brain. Deep inside the temporal lobe, in the part of the brain that sits behind and slightly above the ear, in tissue that has been performing its particular functions since long before the parts of the brain associated with language and reason had evolved into their current forms. There are 2 structures whose relationship to each other determines almost everything about how you recognize the world. The first of these structures is the hippocampus, a curved and densely connected piece of tissue roughly the length of a thumb, named by early anatomists for its resemblance to a seahorse. the most faithful archivist the brain possesses. It is responsible not merely for storing experiences, but for encoding them with their full contextual frame. The when and the where and the who. The complete address of each moment as it is lived, so that when you later retrieve a memory, it arrives not as a free-floating image, but as a thing, located precisely in the narrative of a life, embedded in its surroundings, with everything that came before it and everything that followed it still attached. The way the context in which an object appears is part of what makes the object recognizable. The second structure lies beside and below the first, like a long-practiced colleague who works with less ceremony and considerably more speed. This structure, the part of the brain that processes familiarity, is responsible not for the full contextual retrieval of memories, but for something more immediate, a rapid assessment of whether something has been encountered before, issued not as a memory, but as a feeling, a quality of the present moment that arrives before any specific recollection, and says simply, without evidence or justification, "This is known, this has been here before. This is not entirely new." A signal so fast and so direct that it reaches conscious experience before the slower, more thorough archivist has had time to look anything up. Under ordinary circumstances, these two systems operate in a coordination so seamless that the experience of recognition feels like a single event. The familiarity arrives first, almost instantly, and the deeper memory follows within fractions of a second with the contextual information that explains it. And the whole thing is complete before the conscious mind has had time to participate in it. So that what you experience is not a sequence, but a simultaneous, unified act of knowing. Yes, and I know why, and I know when, and I know exactly where this fits in the story of my life. But occasionally, under conditions of fatigue, or at moments when the brain's processing load is higher than usual, or simply in the ordinary variability of a system managing billions of signals at once, something in this coordination fails. The familiarity signal fires without the contextual retrieval that should accompany it. What reaches, conscious experience, is the first without the second. The feeling of recognition without the memory that would justify it. The certainty of having been here before arriving fully formed and absolutely convincing, and without any archive in the world that can be opened to explain it. This is the mechanism. This is what is happening at the level of neural tissue and electrochemical signaling. In those few seconds when the present moment briefly becomes indistinguishable from a memory that cannot be found. There is another layer to this worth holding alongside the first. Something about the way the brain assembles experience that helps explain why the phenomenon arrives so suddenly, so completely, and so convincingly. The brain does not process sensory experience as a single unified stream. When you stand at that kitchen counter on that Tuesday afternoon, what reaches your conscious awareness as a seamless and coherent moment? The weight of the glass, the sound of the street, the particular quality of the light, is actually assembled in real time from dozens of separate channels, each handling a different aspect of the incoming information, each operating at slightly different speeds, each feeding its output into a central assembly process that synchronizes all these parallel streams into the unified experience of a single moment. And sometimes, in conditions of tiredness or heightened emotional resonance or certain transitional states of attention, one of those channels arrives at the assembly point a fraction of a second ahead of the others. The brain processes it once, registers it, issues its familiarity assessment, and then receives it again, bundled with everything else, in what feels like a second pass through the same experience. The system that monitors for this kind of double registration sends up its flag. This has already happened. This has already been registered. And in the gap between that flag and the empty archive that should contain the original event, the experience is born. The present moment seeming to be a memory of itself. Time seeming to briefly and impossibly double back on its own heels. The now becoming, for a few uncanny seconds, the already then. Let that rest in you for a moment. What is remarkable about this? What deserves to settle into you slowly, the way warmth settles into a body that has finally been allowed to stop moving, is not merely the elegance of the mechanism, but what it implies about the nature of the experience. Because the researchers who have spent their careers understanding this phenomenon have arrived at a conclusion that feels, when you stay with it, like something more than a finding about neurons. They have concluded that the experience of already having been here, far from being a malfunction, may in fact be a sign that the brain's error detection systems are working exactly as they should. The sense of something strange, the vertigo, the quality of unreality, the specific unease of a certainty that has no evidence, is the brain noticing in real time that one of its signals is in conflict with the archive, and flagging the conflict rather than allowing it to pass unexamined. It is delivering that flag to conscious experience as the particular, specific, intimately familiar sensation of a moment that has already been lived and cannot be remembered. Which is not a mistake, but a report. Not a glitch, but a dispatch from the brain's most careful monitoring systems, saying, "Something here does not add up, and I am telling you about it, even though I cannot tell you why." The scientists discovered all of this, not through theory, but through the most direct form of evidence available to them, which was to watch it happen. They sat with patients whose neurological condition meant that this phenomenon was not a fleeting visitor, but a sustained and sometimes disabling presence. Patients who could describe the experience in real time, while electrodes placed with extraordinary precision recorded what was happening in the depths of the temporal lobe during it. And who could, when those same electrodes were used to deliver a precisely calibrated electrical current to the familiarity processing region, experience the entire thing deliberately, on demand, in the clinical environment of a research hospital. The feeling of having already been here arriving, not from any past experience, but from a few milliamps of current, touching the right few millimeters of neural tissue. This is the moment in the story where the door opens, rather than closes. Because the fact that the experience can be produced by a current touching a specific region of neural tissue does not make it less real or less significant or less worth asking about, any more than the fact that the experience of color is produced by photons triggering specific receptors in the retina makes the color of the sky less blue or less worth looking at on a morning when the light is doing something particular to it that the light does not always do. The mechanism is one thing. The experience, the specific, private, unrepeatable quality of standing in a moment that seems to have already been lived, the sense of the present reaching back into itself and finding something already there, is another thing entirely. And it is that experience that human beings have been sitting with and asking about for as long as there have been human beings capable of asking questions about what the inside of being alive is like. Let the body settle a little further now, and let the thinking grow slightly looser and more permissive. The way it does at this time of night, when the demands of the day have finally receded far enough to allow the mind to move at its own pace. Because the part of the story we are about to enter is older than science, older than the name we gave the experience, older, possibly, than the written word itself. long before anyone had a name for it. The experience was there. It arrived in the bodies and the minds of people who had no framework of neural architecture within which to place it, and who were therefore required to sit with it more directly than we are. Required to encounter it without the reassurance that it has been explained. Required to ask what it meant in the only terms available to them, which were the terms of myth and philosophy and the careful, patient, multi-generational observation of what it is like to be a consciousness moving through time. What they found, what they kept finding, in cultures that had no contact with each other, approaching the question from entirely different directions, accumulating their understanding across different spans of centuries and different landscapes. Points, with a consistency that is worth noticing, toward the same territory. Begin in Athens, in the 4th century, before the Common Era. A garden where the light falls in a way that the olive trees have been filtering for centuries, and where a man named Plato is working through a question about knowledge that will eventually lead him to one of the strangest and most durable conclusions in the history of philosophy. The question begins as a question about learning. How is it possible to learn anything at all? If at the moment of learning you do not yet know what you are trying to learn well enough to recognize it when you encounter it, and if you already knew it, you would have no need to learn it. Plato calls this the paradox of inquiry, and the answer he arrives at, the answer he has Socrates propose, through the demonstration that a young slave with no mathematical training can be led, by questioning alone and without any instruction, to discover the correct proof of a geometric theorem he has never encountered, is one of the most disorienting ideas in the history of human thought. The answer is this: you are not learning anything. You are remembering. The knowledge was there before the conversation began, before this lifetime began, before the first breath of this particular incarnation entered this particular body. The soul, in Plato's account, carried it forward from a previous existence in a realm where all the truths that can ever be known were encountered directly, without the mediation of imperfect senses. And the trauma of being born into a body caused the soul to forget what it had known, not to lose it, but to submerge it, so that the entire experience of a mortal life is, at its deepest level, not the accumulation of new knowledge, but the gradual recovery of what was always already there. He called this the undoing of forgetting, the removal of the veil that birth laid over what the soul already knew, the process of returning to what was never actually lost. And there is something in this image. The veil over what is already known, the certainty that precedes any justifying memory, the recognition that arrives without any archive to open, that resonates with the inside of this experience in a way that the scientific account, however accurate and however important, does not quite reach. Because this phenomenon does not feel like a malfunction, even when you know that is what it is. It feels like something surfacing, something that was already there, finding a gap in the ordinary management of experience and coming briefly through. Not as a specific memory, not the content of what was known, but as the quality of having known. The sensation of the veil thinning for just a moment. The sense of a recognition so deep it precedes any particular thing that could be recognized. Notice, if you will, how that description sits in the body. Whether it feels, from the inside, closer to the truth than the language of neural channels and timing errors. Whether Plato's account is a literal, is a metaphysics or a profound philosophical image for something real about the structure of consciousness is a question that has been generating careful argument for 2,400 years and shows no sign of resolving. But the territory it describes, the felt quality of it, the specific texture of what it is like from the inside, is recognizable to anyone who has stood in that strange suspended moment when the present seems to be a memory of itself. Move now from Athens to the Ganges plain, to a tradition that was being refined at roughly the moment Plato was writing, and that approaches the same territory through a completely different architecture. The concept of deep impressions in the Sanskrit philosophical tradition. The marks left in the fabric of consciousness by everything that has been experienced. The traces that experience leaves in the material of the mind, the way water leaves its trace in stone, shaping it slowly and permanently in ways that persist long after the water itself has moved on. Rests on an understanding of consciousness as something more than a blank surface that accumulates experiences and then ceases when the body ceases. In this understanding, consciousness is a medium that holds the shape of what has been pressed into it, and that medium carries forward the impressions of one life into the next, so that the soul arriving at a new birth arrives already carrying, below the accessible surface of its new experience, the compressed and transformed residue of everything it has already been. In this understanding, the moment of already having been here is not an error. It is a surfacing. The brief emergence of an impression from a previous life into the present one. The moment when something laid down in another existence becomes faintly perceptible through the membrane that ordinarily separates one incarnation from the next. The familiar street that should be entirely new. The stranger whose face your body recognizes before your mind has any account of why. The moment that your entire nervous system insists has already happened, even as every retrievable memory confirms it has not. Let that image stay with you for a moment, while we move to a closely related but subtly different tradition. Buddhism, which grew from the same soil and shares much of its architecture while differing significantly in its metaphysics, preserves a version of the same intuition, and preserves it with a precision that is worth staying with, because its account of what carries across lifetimes is more careful and in some ways stranger. Buddhism denies the existence of a permanent, unchanging self, denies that there is a fixed soul substance that moves intact from one body to the next, the way a traveler moves from one house to another, and yet affirms that something continues, something carries, something is transmitted across the gap between one life and the next, and that something is not a thing but a process, not a substance but a pattern, a continuously evolving configuration of tendencies and habits, and the consequences of past choices that shapes the conditions of each new, arising the way a river shapes the landscape it moves through, without the river at any given moment being the same water that shaped it. The word for this process, in its full and precise sense, is not the simplified popular version of cosmic reward and punishment, but something more technical. Action and its momentum, the way that every act of body and speech and mind leaves behind it a tendency toward similar acts, a groove in the fabric of consciousness that makes certain future experiences more likely and certain responses more automatic, a shaping of what will be experienced and how it will be experienced that persists beyond the individual life, because it is not stored in the biology of a particular body, but in something that the biology expresses without containing. And within this framework, the experience of already having been here takes on a meaning that sits with remarkable precision at the place where the scientific and the ancient meet. A moment when a pattern laid down in a previous configuration of this same ongoing stream of consciousness is briefly recognizable in the current one. When the shape of a past life shows through the surface of the present one, the way the shape of old foundations sometimes shows through the floor of a building that has been built over them. Consider what this means for the quality of the experience, for the way it actually feels from the inside. There is something in it that is not simply disorienting, not simply the vertigo of a signal without a source. There is also, underneath the vertigo and running through it like a thread of warmth in cold water, something that many people describe as a quality of comfort, of recognition that goes beyond ordinary familiarity, of the present moment feeling briefly more inhabited than it usually feels. More layered, more dense, with a presence that extends backward in a direction that the ordinary experience of moving forward through time does not provide. As if the moment, for those few seconds, contains more of you than the moment usually does. As if a part of you that normally exists below the accessible surface has briefly become accessible. Not as information, not as retrievable memory, but as quality, as a felt change in the density of the present. Now move with me from the Ganges plain to the courts of medieval Andalusia, where one of the greatest mystical philosophers of the Islamic tradition was working on a problem that would take him an entire lifetime and produce a body of writing that scholars are still working through today. The Sufi tradition, which represents one of the world's most sustained and technically sophisticated engagements with the nature of consciousness and time, Bukhari expressed what it found in vocabulary that has a precision and a beauty that the science and the philosophy together do not quite replicate. The great mystical poets of this tradition return again and again to images of time as something that does not move in only one direction, as something that contains within its apparent flow a dimension of stillness, a dimension in which the past and the present, and what the ordinary mind calls the future, are not separated by the absolute boundaries that embodied consciousness enforces on them. The Andalusian philosopher described what he called the isthmus, a threshold, a dimension of reality that exists between the purely spiritual and the purely material, between the eternal and the temporal. A dimension in which the soul, in states of heightened awareness or in the interval between lives, has access simultaneously to what ordinary consciousness experiences as past and present and future, not because those distinctions cease to exist, but because in the isthmus, the consciousness is not constrained to a single moving point within the structure of time, but can perceive, however briefly and however incompletely, something of the structure as a whole. This is not, in his account, a supernatural or miraculous state. It is the soul's natural condition, temporarily obscured by the demands of embodied life, the way the sky is temporarily obscured by cloud cover. Not gone, but simply not currently accessible. Available to those who have cultivated the particular quality of inner attention that makes the cloud cover briefly transparent, and available to everyone, without cultivation and without intention, in the few seconds of this experience when the ordinary enforcement of a single present moment becomes, for reasons the science can describe in detail, momentarily less absolute. There are other traditions that found their way to the same edge from entirely different directions. The Celtic peoples of Ireland and Wales and Scotland spoke of thin places, and by which they meant not metaphor, but topography. Actual locations in the landscape where the membrane between the ordinary flow of time and whatever lay beneath it was notably more permeable than elsewhere, where the sense of time having depth, of the present being underlaid by a permanent and still accessible past, was perceptible not only in moments of unusual attention, but simply by being present in the place, by standing in the particular air of it, and letting the particular light of it fall on you. These thin places were not all dramatic or spectacular. They were not necessarily the tops of mountains or the edges of oceans, though they were often those things. But they were reliably places where ordinary time seemed to become briefly translucent, where the sense of the present resting on a deep and continuously present past was not a philosophical position, but a felt experience. as immediate and as unmistakable as the smell of the air after rain, and where the experience of already having been here, if it occurred in such a place, was understood not as an error or curiosity, but as the expected consequence of standing somewhere that had always made the depth of time perceptible, a confirmation of the location's nature, rather than an anomaly within it. This is, in spatial and geographical form, precisely the quality that this phenomenon creates in temporal form. The sensation of the surface of experience becoming briefly transparent, and through that transparency, the presence of something older and more continuous making itself known, not with the drama of revelation, but with the quiet specificity of simple recognition. Yes, this is here. This has always been here. The ordinary surface of things was simply not showing it. And then there is a philosopher of an entirely different kind, one who stands at the opposite end of the arc from the mystics and the Vedic sages, one who would have been deeply uncomfortable with the metaphysical architecture of any of them, one who was in many respects a sustained philosophical argument against the consolations that traditions like these offer, and who nevertheless arrives, through the sheer force of a rigorously applied intelligence, at an image of time that resonates with all of them. Friedrich Nietzsche, writing in the second half of the 19th century, developed what he called the eternal return. The thought experiment that asks you to imagine that this moment, this exact configuration of everything, has already occurred an infinite number of times before, and will occur an infinite number of times again. Not approximately, but with exact fidelity. The same in every particular, the same joy and the same grief and the same ordinary Tuesday afternoon, with the same quality of light falling at the same angle across the same surface, endlessly, without variation, without beginning and without end. Nietzsche offered this primarily as an ethical challenge, a way of asking how you would live differently if you knew that the life you were living was not a single event moving toward a conclusion, but an endlessly repeated pattern in which every choice you made was a choice you would be making forever. But underneath the ethical question, the image of time it contains has its own peculiar resonance with the experience of standing in a moment that seems to have already been lived. If every moment has already happened and will happen again, then the sense of having been here before is not an error produced by a temporary neural desynchronization, but the most accurate perception available to a consciousness embedded in a structure of time that circles back on itself at a scale too vast for ordinary experience to register. With the phenomenon of already having been here as the one moment when the circularity briefly becomes perceptible, when the returning wave is briefly visible as a returning wave rather than as simply the next wave in a sequence that appears from inside a single pass through it, to be moving in only one direction. None of these traditions are making the same claim. The Greek undoing of forgetting, the deep impressions of the Vedic sages, the Buddhist continuity of accumulated action, the Celtic thin places, Nietzsche's eternal return. These are different structures built from different materials toward different purposes, and they cannot all be literally true simultaneously. And there is no synthesis available that would make them all consistent with each other and with the science that describes the same territory from the other side. But they are all pressing against the same limit. The limit of what a consciousness that experiences time as a single, forward-moving sequence can hold about the depth and complexity of what time actually is. And they are all reporting, from that limit, something recognizably similar. That the experience of already having been here is not simply a malfunction, not simply noise in the signal, but something that touches, briefly, imperfectly, from the inside of an experience that lasts only a few seconds. Something true about the nature of a time that is more complex than the ordinary management of a day allows it to appear. Let that settle now, and let the thinking grow softer, and the breath slower, and the attention less focused on the ideas themselves and more available to the quality of the night that is gathered around you. Because what comes next is not more information and not more history, but simply the invitation to stay with the question from inside your own experience of it. From inside the specific, unrepeatable, perfectly ordinary, and completely extraordinary fact of being a consciousness. Here, in this room, in this darkness, at this moment that is already, even as you are in it, in becoming the past. In the spring of 1955, a few weeks after the death of his closest and oldest friend, Albert Einstein sat down to write a letter of condolence to the man's widow. And in that letter, he wrote something that has been reproduced and cited and debated ever since, because it is, in the span of a single sentence, both a statement of profound personal grief and one of the most compressed summaries of what a lifetime of rethinking the nature of reality had led him to. He wrote, "The distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion." He was not writing as a grieving man, reaching for consolation in the only vocabulary available to him. He was writing as a physicist who had spent 50 years following the implications of his own equations, and what those equations implied, what the theory of relativity had revealed about the structure of the universe, was, in the most technical and rigorous sense, precisely this: that the present moment is not a fixed and universal feature of reality, that it is not a knife edge cutting across the whole of space-time simultaneously, separating what has happened from what has not yet happened, making the past irrevocably gone, and the future genuinely non-existent until it arrives. Hold that for a moment. What relativity showed was that two observers moving at different velocities relative to each other will not agree on which events are simultaneous. That the sequence of events, which came first and which came after, is not an absolute property of the events themselves, but a function of the observer's position and motion. That there is no universal present running through the universe like a line drawn across a map. What appears to be the present from one vantage point appears as past or future from another, with neither vantage point being more correct than the other, because neither is describing a feature of reality rather than a feature of their particular relationship to it. The structure that physics arrived at to describe a universe in which this is true is called the block universe, a model in which all of time, past and present and future, exists simultaneously as a four-dimensional whole, the way all of space exists simultaneously as a three-dimensional whole, with different times being as genuinely and permanently real as different places, with the past not gone but simply located at different coordinates in the structure, with the future not non-existent but simply located at coordinates not yet reached by the particular trajectory of a given observer. In this model, the experience of time passing, of the present moment moving, of the future becoming the present and the present becoming the past, is not a description of the structure, but a feature of a particular kind of consciousness embedded in it, moving through it in one direction at one speed, perceiving it through instruments, calibrated to register only the slice it is currently passing through, experiencing the sequence of slices as a flow in the way that a train passenger experiences the landscape as moving when it is the train that is moving. The past, in this model, is not where it feels like it is. It does not feel gone because it is gone. It feels gone because you are no longer at those coordinates. the way a city feels absent when you have left it. Not because it has ceased to exist, but because the coordinates of your current position are not the coordinates of its current position, and the distance between you has grown too great for ordinary perception to bridge. Now hold this image. The image of the past, not as something that is dissolved into nothing, but as something located elsewhere in a structure that is entirely present, entirely real, entirely there. And hold it alongside the experience of already having been here, alongside those few seconds when the present moment seems to recognize itself as a moment that has already been lived, when the sense of having been here before arrives with a conviction that no retrievable memory can account for. What if the brief desynchronization of the familiarity and recollective systems in the brain creates not an illusion of the past, but a momentary loosening of the selectivity through which consciousness ordinarily accesses only a single slice of the structure? What if the filter that ordinarily enforces the experience of a single moving present becomes, for those few seconds, slightly more permeable? Not broken, not malfunctioning in any damaging sense, but simply less absolute in its enforcement. And what comes through in that slight permeability is not a specific memory retrieved from an archive, but something more direct. The actual, genuine, structurally real presence of a past moment that exists at different coordinates in the block universe, briefly detectable not as a record, but as a presence, not as a file that has been retrieved, but as a location that has been, however briefly and incompletely, accessed. This is not a claim that can be proven, and it is important to hold that clearly. It is a possibility, an image, a way of thinking about the experience that does not require dismissing it as mere error, but also does not require inflating it into something more dramatic than what it actually is. A brief, partial, imperfect, genuinely felt contact with the depth of a time that the block universe model suggests is really there. Made available by a temporary loosening of the constraints that ordinarily hold consciousness to its single moving point within the structure. Let the image grow smaller and more intimate now. Because the question we have been approaching through the physics and the philosophy and the long history of human traditions is not ultimately a question about space-time or about the temporal lobe or about Plato's garden. It is a question about this. The specific, unrepeatable, perfectly ordinary texture of what it is like to be you. Here, in this room, in this particular moment that is flowing imperceptibly into the next, even as you are in it. You carry your history the way a landscape carries weather, not as files you can retrieve on demand, not as a conscious archive of everything that has led to this moment, but as the actual shape of who you are, pressed into you by everything that has ever happened to you the way the shape of a valley is pressed into the earth by the river that has been moving through it for 10,000 years. Not remembered by the earth, not stored anywhere the earth can access, but present. Present in every contour, present in the particular angle of every slope, present in the specific way the light falls across the terrain at certain times of day, present as form rather than as memory, as substance rather than as record. Every person whose voice has mattered to, as you has shaped the specific sensitivity with which you hear voices now. Not as a stored memory of them, not as a file you could open and review, but as an actual modification of the tissue that processes sound. A slight and permanent adjustment of what resonates and what does not, what carries and what falls flat, what makes the attention quicken and what lets it rest. Every place you have loved has shaped the particular quality of attention you bring to place. What you notice in a room, what you feel walking into a landscape, what makes a location feel inhabited and what makes it feel merely occupied. Every grief you have moved through is present in the specific way you hold the uncertainty that grief teaches, the particular ease or difficulty with which you allow the present to be uncertain, the exact shape of the capacity for patience that loss either builds or fails to build in a person who has been through it. None of this is memory. All of this is you. The history is not stored somewhere accessible. It is the material that the present version of you is made of. The way the iron in your blood is not stored somewhere in the body, but is the blood, is the actual functioning iron doing its actual work, with no memory of the star that forged it, and no need of any. What you are, right now, is the accumulated consequence of everything that has already happened. Not the memory of it, not the story of it, not the consciously retrievable account of it, but the actual result of it, the shape that all of it has produced in this particular piece of the world, this particular configuration that constitutes the specific and unrepeatable version of a human being that is lying here in this room, in this darkness, breathing this particular breath, resting in this particular way, being held by this particular night. And in those moments of already having been here, in those few seconds when the present seems to recognize itself, when the sense of deep familiarity arrives without any archive to explain it, what might be happening is not merely a neural misfiring, but something that touches, however briefly and however imperfectly, the truth of this, that you have been here before, in the deepest available sense of that phrase. Because here, not this room, but the experience of being a consciousness moving through time, is the same territory that has always been the territory. The same quality of being present in a moment that has never been anything other than what it is, no matter how many moments have preceded it or will follow it. The past is not gone. It is the material that the present is made of. Let the attention move gently now across the body that is lying here. Not to examine it, but simply to register it, to feel the weight of it against whatever is supporting it tonight. Notice the specific warmth of the points of contact between skin and surface, the rise and fall of the breath, fall of the air in the chest and the belly. The quality of the air in the room, which is slightly different from the air outside, slightly warmer and more still, carrying in it the faint traces of everything that has happened here today, and in all the days before today. Notice the hands, wherever they have settled. The hands that have touched so many things today and across so many days and years. Each touch a small exchange of warmth and information that has shaped the specific sensitivity of these hands, their particular readiness to hold and to release and to recognize by touch. All of that history present, not as memory, but as the actual physical fact of what these hands have become. The precision stored in the tendons and the muscles about how to hold and how to let go. All of it accumulated experience made into flesh. Notice the shoulders and the jaw. The places where the day tends to lodge itself in the body, even after the mind has released it, where the readiness that the day, that required holds on past the moment when holding on is necessary, where something in the body continues to brace against demands that have already ended. Let those places release a little more, not through effort, but simply through the permission of noticing them, the way a knot sometimes loosens when you bring your full attention to it, rather than simply pulling against it. Notice the breath, not to control it, not to change it, just to feel the rhythm of it. The slow expansion and the pause at the top and the slow release and the pause at the bottom. And then the expansion again. This rhythm that has been the body's ongoing conversation with the world since the first breath, that has continued through every hour of waking and sleeping. through every state of rest and every state of effort, through joy and grief and the long, unremarkable stretches of ordinary time that constitute most of a life. Continuing now without your attention or your assistance. Doing what it has always done. Knowing something about the relationship between the body and the air. That the conscious mind was not involved in learning and does not need to be involved in maintaining. The air moving through you right now has been part of other bodies, part of other breaths, part of the atmosphere of other rooms on other nights, when other people lay in their own particular darkness and held their own version of whatever it is that gets held in the quiet hours. The unresolved questions and the settled ones. The things that needed to be thought about and the things that turned out to need only to be allowed to rest. Now this same air is here, briefly, passing through you on its way to wherever air goes next. And you are changing it slightly in passing, and it is changing you slightly in passing. And neither of you is quite what you were before the exchange, which is how it has always been, which is the most ordinary description available of what it means to be alive in a world that is made of continuous exchange, continuous circulation, continuous transformation of one thing into another, without any of it being lost. There is something that happens to a body that has been lying still long enough. A sequence of releases that follows its own order without needing to be directed, moving through the large muscles and then the small ones, through the deliberate tension and then the habitual tension, and then the tension that has been there so long it has forgotten it is tension, through the muscles of the face and the space behind the eyes, and finally something more than the muscles. Something more like the quality of watchfulness itself. The background readiness that the body maintains even in rest in case it is needed. And this too releases by increments. Until what remains is not the absence of the body, but its presence in a different mode. Not the presence of something ready to act, but the presence of something resting in the full weight of its own existence, not performing anything, not waiting for anything, simply being what it is, which is enough, which has always been enough. And the body already knows this, not as a thought and not as a conclusion reached by following an argument to its end, but as the simple, unremarkable, continuous fact of being what it is. Consider the iron again, the iron in the blood, the iron that was forged in a star and traveled through space and became part of the earth and part of the ocean and part of the chain of living things that led to you. That iron is not stored somewhere in the body. It is the body doing its work, carrying its oxygen, with no awareness of its history and no need of any. The history is simply present in the fact of the iron being here, doing this, being what it has become. This is the deepest sense in which you have been here before. Not in this room, not on this particular night, not with this particular arrangement of everything that constitutes the current version of a life. But here, in time, in the ongoing fact of being present in a moment, which is the same fact that every consciousness that has ever been present in any moment has been in, with the same quality of nowness that has characterized every now that has ever occurred, the same sense of being at the edge of experience, looking forward into what has not yet happened, backward into what can no longer be changed. Every consciousness that has ever existed has been here, in this sense. Every person who has ever lain in the dark at the end of a day and felt the body releasing the tensions of the hours just past, who has heard the breath slowing and felt the weight settling and allowed the thoughts to lose their urgency and become simply thoughts, passing through without being held, every one of them has been in this same territory. The territory that has no geography and no history and no particular coordinates in space-time, but that is recognizable to anyone who has ever been still enough to be in it. And when the experience of already having been here comes, when the ordinary present briefly seems to recognize itself, when the familiarity signal fires without the retrieval that should explain it, and the result is those few uncanny seconds of the present seeming to be a memory of itself. What might be briefly accessible is not a specific past moment, but this: the quality of the territory itself, the sense of this same ground that has always been here, that was here before you were born and will be here after you are gone, the territory that every consciousness that has ever existed has moved through, and that the experience of already having been here briefly makes perceptible by thinning for just those few seconds the ordinary opacity of the present moment's surface. This is why it feels, when it comes, like something being remembered and not something being encountered for the first time. Because in a sense that the ordinary language of memory does not quite reach, it is. The territory is genuinely familiar, not because you have been to this particular room or seen this particular light before, but because the quality of being present, the texture of nowness, the weight of this specific kind of aliveness that consciousness in a body moving through time has, is something you have been in continuously, without interruption, for as long as you have been conscious, and something that every other consciousness that has ever existed has been in for as long as it existed, and something that may be, in ways that the science is still learning to describe, not merely continuous within a single life, but continuous across a much larger territory than the borders of a single life usually encompass. The question does not need to be answered tonight. It does not need to be resolved before you sleep or held tightly as something to be returned to in the morning. It can simply be allowed to be what it is, which is not a problem requiring a solution, but a quality of attention that has opened in the course of this night's listening. A slight and persistent awareness of something that has always been present beneath the ordinary surface of things. Something that the body has always known in the way that iron knows what it is made of, which is not as a thought or a memory or a belief, but as the simple, unremarkable, continuously present fact of being it. Let that knowledge, the wordless knowledge of the body, that has been everything it has been and is now this, and that will continue to be something after it is no longer this. Let that knowledge settle now into whatever space is left in the body after the questions have released their grip and the muscles have released their tension, and the breath has settled into its deepest and most automatic rhythm. Let it settle the way sediment settles in water that has finally gone. Still, not with any drama, not with any sense of arrival or conclusion, simply by the natural consequence of the motion having stopped and the weight being allowed, at last, to find its own level, to rest in the place that gravity has always been preparing for it. The experience of already having been here will come again, not tonight, and not in the kind of attention that the deliberate mind brings to a question, but in an ordinary moment that will arrive without announcing itself. In the middle of a morning that had given no indication it intended to be anything other than completely unremarkable. And in those few seconds, before the explanation arrives and covers the experience back over, there is a quality available that is worth noticing, worth staying with rather than immediately moving past, worth letting rest in the body for the duration of its brief visit. The quality is this: the present moment, for those few seconds, seems to have more depth than it usually has. The surface of experience becomes slightly transparent, and through that transparency, something older and more continuous becomes briefly perceptible. Not as a specific memory, not as a retrievable event with coordinates in the past, but as a quality of the present itself. a felt sense of the now being underlaid by something that has always been there. Present in every now that has ever been experienced, the way the ocean is present in every wave without being visible as the ocean from the surface of any particular wave. The way the ground is present beneath every footstep without the foot that takes the step needing to think about the ground for the ground to be doing what the ground does. Let the questions go entirely loose now, not resolved, not set aside to be returned to later, but simply allowed to become softer and less urgent. The way the body is becoming softer and less urgent right now, the way the breath is slowing below the pace of thinking and continuing beneath it. What remains when the inquiry settles is not a conclusion, but a quality of inhabiting the present moment with some slight awareness of the depth from which it has arisen, some barely perceptible sense of the present as the current expression of everything that has ever been present. Not as a thought that can be held and examined, but as something closer to a temperature, a texture, a barely detectable warmth in the ordinary fact of being here. Which is to say, in the ordinary, extraordinary, continuously astonishing fact of being at all. The body knows this without being told. The body is made of this, made of the long history of the universe expressing itself in this particular form, for this particular duration, with this particular quality of awareness that is capable, on occasion and without warning, of becoming briefly aware of itself as an expression of something that extends far beyond the borders of a single life and a single night. The iron in your blood was forged in the interior of a star that burned for millions of years, and then ended in an explosion so complete that for a few weeks it outshone the entire galaxy that contained it. The iron it scattered into space traveled through the cold dark for longer than there have been living things on Earth, and eventually became part of the cloud that condensed into this solar system, and eventually became part of the ocean, and eventually became part of the chemistry of living things, and eventually became part of you, doing the specific and irreplaceable work that iron does in blood, carrying oxygen to every cell of the body that is lying here right now, doing this work without any memory of the star that made it possible, without any awareness of the billions of years that separate that first forging from this particular night. Simply present, simply functional, simply the current form of something very old that is doing what very old things do, which is continue. You are the continuation of all of this, not the product of it, in the sense of something produced and then separate from its source, but the continuation itself, the current expression of a process that has been unfolding since the first moment, carrying forward the same matter and the same energy through every transformation, all of it arriving here, in this room, in this breath, in this particular and unrepeatable quality of a night that is also continuous with every night that has preceded it. The labyrinth was always a path. This is one of the things that the oldest users of that image understood, that what appeared from outside to be a trap, a structure designed to confuse and to prevent escape, was from inside simply a path. And the path, however it wound, and however many times it appeared to reverse direction, and however long it took to arrive anywhere recognizable, led eventually to the center, and from the center led back out, and the person who had walked it knew something that the person who had only looked at it from outside could not know. Not information about the structure, but something about what it is like to trust a path that you can't see the end of, to keep walking when the next turn is not visible, to carry the question without the answer for as long as the path requires. The path has led here, to this room, and this body, and this breath, and this particular quality of the night that has gathered around everything that is trying to rest in it, including the thoughts that are slowly losing their definition at the edges and the questions that are slowly releasing their grip on the urgency they carried into the room. The present moment is not alone. It is the current expression of everything that has ever been present, carrying forward in every atom and every capacity that has been developed by the accumulated weight of everything that has already happened, carrying it all forward into this moment and making this moment from it, the way the ocean makes each wave from the full depth of everything below the surface. With all of that depth invisibly present in the particular shape and weight and movement of this wave. On this night, in this room, in this breath, in this dark. Rest now, and let the question that has been moving through this night settle into the body the way warmth settles, the way the sense of being held settles, the way sleep settles, not as an answer, but as a quality, a barely perceptible shift in the texture of the present moment, a sense of the depth that is always there becoming, for a little while longer than usual, slightly more perceptible before it fades back below the ordinary surface of things, leaving behind it only the room and the breath and the dark, which is enough, which has always been enough, which is all that is needed and more than can ever be fully received. You have been here before, and here has always been here, and here is where you are, and you are held. Good night.